afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the ALMT Legal webinar series. My name is Tatira Ranina, and I'm a partner with ALMT Legal Mumbai office. The purpose of this webinar is really to share knowledge and to bring to each of you sitting at home eminent speakers who are leaders in their field. As they say, every cloud has a silver lining. And I'm sure that each of you would agree that the silver lining in the COVID cloud is the extent of sharing of knowledge in our legal fraternity today. I mean, I've never seen something like this in my years of practice. And so this definitely is a silver lining. To that end, today's webinar is on interpreting the Constitution, theories, doctrines, and controversies. And our speaker is Mr. Arvind Datar. I'm very happy to introduce Mr. Datar to you. And while I am sure that most of you are aware that Mr. Datar is a senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court, the Madras and other high courts, here are some of his accomplishments. He is the author of several books, such as The Commentary on the Constitution of India, the third edition of which will be released in August 2020, Guide to Central Excise, Guide to Excise Procedures, and is the co-author of Nani Palkhiwala, the Courtroom Genius, with Mr. Soli Sorabji. He is the chief editor of the forthcoming 11th edition of Kanga and Palkhiwala's Law and Practice of Income Tax, and has been the general editor of the Festschrift published on the birth centenary of Mr. Nani Palkhiwala. Mr. Datar, we really appreciate the effort that you have taken, sir, in preparing this presentation. And we are very much looking forward to hearing you this afternoon. Mr. Datar, we can begin. Please put up the presentation.
Yes, can I start? Or
yes, please.
Yes. First of all, thanks to Statira Ranina of ALMT and all our colleagues. In particular, I'd like to thank Janika Solanki, Siddhi Ghatlia, and Vaishak Kapadia for making this presentation possible. I sent them my slides and they'll be helping me in making this as effective a program as it possibly can. Apart from the Bombay team, I'd also like to thank my colleagues in Chennai, Rahul Unikrishnan, my colleague Janvi Sindhu in Delhi, and Gautam Bhatia, who is now in London. I must thank them for all their help and assistance. I must also particularly thank Dr. Jain, who is the principal of the ILS Law College, Pune, for his contribution and suggestions. When Statira first spoke to me and asked me to speak on a subject on the Constitution, I was hesitant because the last thing you want to hear during lockdown on an afternoon is some boring topic on the Constitution, but she was persistent. And I thought that instead of speaking on fundamental rights or on a particular topic, I would speak on interpretation of a Constitution. I said a Constitution because these principles apply to any Constitution. And the idea was that I will give you the theories and doctrines which will be helpful on a daily basis whenever we are arguing a writ petition before the High Court or challenging the validity of a statute or interpreting a constitutional provision. These principles and doctrines, theories and doctrines will certainly help us. So without much ado, I'll straight away start off. Now, the way I have divided my talk is that I have prepared about 16 slides. The first 8 slides are on the principles involved, and then the remaining 8 slides are on application of these principles. So you'll get a mixture of theory and the practice. And I will try to explain how the Supreme Court has applied different theories and doctrines to arrive at its own conclusions. Now, let me go away straight away to the, and I should take about 40-45 minutes to complete my presentation. And then I will put it for questions and answers to those of you who wish to ask questions. So without much ado, let me start. And I would First, take the first slide. I hope all of you have got the first slide on the screen. And it is statutory interpretation versus constitutional interpretation. Is there a difference? I'll come to that shortly. But then one thing is, what is the difference between basic statute and a constitutional interpretation? And if you see on the screen, you'll find that a constitution vis-a-vis a statute, the basic difference is that constitution broadly gives you general principles of governance. It is a document which has a vision to the future. It tries to lay down how a particular country wants to govern itself, how the people have delegated the powers to different organs of the government, and so on. So you've got the theory of a living tree and so on. Now, broadly speaking, constitutions can be divided into two types, broadly. One are the short constitutions where the values are laid down, value-laden principles are laid down. And the other is a detailed constitution, which is more akin to a statute, and the most common example is India. Now the question arises, why do you require a constitution itself? Why can't you simply have a parliamentary act to govern the daily situations? And there the answer is perhaps best contained in the Federalist, paper 51 by James Madison. I've just given a nice sentence. He says, if men were angels, no government will be necessary. And as all of us know that men are not angels, none of us are. And Madison then says that because men are not angels, you require auxiliary precautions. Very nicely put. And this auxiliary precaution is nothing but a written constitution. Let's go to the next slide, please. The second slide, please. Yes. Now, take the Constitution of India. It is a mixture of a statute and value-laden principles. Why do I say that? Now, if you take the Government of India Act, it had 321 sections and 10 schedules. And the Constitution of India in 1950, if you take the first constitution, it had 395 articles and 8 schedules, and 80% of these were from the Government of India Act. So the Constitution of India basically is a mixture of a parliamentary act like the Government of India Act, and we've added to that fundamental rights, directive principles, and so on. So you have a mixture of a statute plus value-laden principles. Now today in 2020, I just did a basic analysis. We now have 425 articles. We added about 30 articles, including the articles relating to panchayats, municipalities, and cooperative societies. I really don't know why the law relating to cooperative society should be part of the constitution. It's quite baffling. We have now 12 schedules. As we speak on the eve of the 1st of May, we have had 104 amendments. And that is the result of approximately 125 amendment bills which were introduced. And 104 got converted into amendments. Now, if you read the Constituent Assembly debates, including Pandit Nehru, there was extensive criticism as to why we are having a lengthy constitution. What is the purpose? And they said a constitution should be brief, it should be small, it should contain principles. You can't have such a constitution which is 400 articles and so on. And in a really outstanding speech on the 4th of November, 1948, Dr. Ambedkar rose up and justified the lengthy constitution. He pointed out practical difficulties, the nature of the Indian society. We have had different religions, different people, different languages, and so on and so forth. And the most important point he makes is this. He says the way in which parliament must function, the way in which legislature must function, the judiciary should be appointed. All these, he said, I feel it's better to lay it down because we don't have, it's a new country, it's a newly born country. We don't have constitutional conventions. And he refers to Grote and Dicey and says that we don't have the constitutional morality. We don't have adherence to conventions. Until that comes apart, there was no option but to have a lengthy constitution. And I personally feel the constitution in its present form was fully justified, keeping in mind the nature of our society, multi-religious, multilingual, and so on and so forth. Next slide, please. Now, the next slide is the need for interpretation. Why do you need? Now, first of all, I personally feel that drafting an act or a constitution is extremely difficult. What is the need for interpretation? If a constitution could be drafted with perfect English, with no ambiguity at all, then there would be no need for interpretation. Indeed, there will be no need for interpretation of any statute. But then that is not the entire problem, because you see we have common words: equality, liberty, religion, compensation, property, and so on. These are all the points which are of words which are have got multiple meanings, multiple things which require interpretation. Now, if you go to the point, the question of interpretation, the fascinating point I personally feel is that you have the same text, you have the same words. At the same time, there are multiple views. Now, take an example of the US Supreme Court. Lawrence Tribe, in his book on the silences of a on reading a constitution, he points out that in 1990, see, Lawrence Tribe points out that in 1990, the US Supreme Court delivered 129 judgments in that year. And out of 129, 37 judgments were by a split verdict of 5:4. So just imagine the same constitutional problem. One third the judgments could have gone either way. That is really the need for interpretation. And if you come back to the Indian statistics, it is very interesting. We were so far from 1950 to 2015. There is a 2-volume book by Mr. Govind Goyal, and he has summarized the number of amendments. You will find that there has been one 13-judge bench, which is of course Kesan Bharati. There have been 8 benches of 11 judges, 15 of 9, 83 of 7, 48 of 6, which is an even number, and we have a staggering number of 2,150 almost 5-judge bench decisions. I think it must have crossed 2150 by now, of 5 judges. So if you total it up, you'll find about approximately we've had about let's say 40 to almost 35 constitution bench decisions per year interpreting the constitution. That really underscores the need for interpretation. So I think this really underscores the need for interpretation. Now I come to 2 important slides which deal with theories and doctrines, and then I'll go into the how these have been applied by different cases. Now let's go to the theories. There are broadly 7 theories which we have called out. One is the textualist, which says just go by the plain meaning. Don't go to the Constituent Assembly debates. Don't go to the history. Don't go to what was discussed in Parliament, what was contemporaneous at that time. Simply put, no text, no external aids. Just take the text and interpret it. Of course, the classic example is, of course, A.K. Gopalan. Then the earlier cases on 368, which I'll come to shortly, where they simply interpreted the text and said, when the meaning is plain, why should we do anything else? But as you'll see in a constitution, you're not interpreting a sales tax law where you can go by the plain meaning. You have to necessarily go into other theories. Next is the originalist theory or the historical theory. The classic illustration of this is the famous book by Robert Bork on the original theory, the original intent, as he calls it. To put it simply, what it requires is you put yourself in a time machine back in 1950 and find out what the federal constitution would have intended, and then interpret or answer your problem accordingly. The third is doctrinal, where it's pro-precedent. Basically, it places great emphasis on following earlier precedents, and it seeks to avoid departures unless absolutely necessary. The fourth is very, very important. It's structural. Structure is, what's the structure of the constitution? What is the arrangement? How are the powers divided? Separation of power. What is, if I may put, the architecture of the constitution? That has to be borne in mind while interpreting your constitution. The fifth is prudentialism, where they try to see what is the cost and benefit involved. That is, if I interpret it this way, what would be the implications? If I interpret it the other way, what would be the costs and benefits? So basically, it's a kind of a trade-off situation where you try and see how the constitution has to be interpreted. The sixth is, which has got a lot of traction recently, is the purposive interpretation by Aaron Barak. He was the former Chief Justice of Israel, a brilliant author. And in his book on purposive interpretation, there is a complete chapter on constitution which bears careful reading. Seventh is ethical. Philip Bobbitt, in his book, he points out ethical is not something moral, immoral kind of situation. When he talks of ethics, he means what is the character of the constitution? What is the ethos of the Indian constitution or the US constitution? And the interpretation which promotes the ethos of that constitution should be followed. Let's go to the next slide, please. So these are the 7 theories. And before I go on to doctrines, I was told that in Yale, when Professor Akhil Amar gave lectures, my friend Janvi Sindhu tells me that he used to say that these theories are like strands of a rope, and you strand them together And then this how you can interweave these theories to answer a particular problem. So that's the importance of theories. From theories, we go to doctrines. Now, I'll go through them quickly because I have to finish in 40-45 minutes. First is the colorable legislation. The classic example was the initial thing of Gajapati Narayan Dev, where colorable means that you ostensibly are trying to show that your law is within the parameters of the constitution, either in terms of competence or in terms of limitations, but actually you are violating the law. In other words, you are doing indirectly what you can't do directly. One was the common example. I've just taken two cases. There are quite a few of them. One is the Bombay Tenure Abolition Act, where the ostensibly they tried to deal with tenures, but in reality they were dealing with the compensation or the rights of the tenure holder. So they said it's a clear case of colorable legislation. The more egregious example and the better example is the Bihar Ordinance, where ordinance is to be passed only for emergency situations. But this DC Wadhwa's case, where they found that the Bihar government had the repeated practice of passing an ordinance, allowing it to lapse. The moment the legislative assembly session got over, again re-promulgate that ordinance again and again and again. And that in a very good judgment by Justice Bhagwati, he says it's a clear, colorable case of power. And they use the word, it's a fraud upon the constitution. That's what they say. It's a fraud on the ordinance making power. Pith and substance is very important. One is, it's basically applied in interpreting legislative entries. A law apparently comes under list 1, but it has got overtones or some shades of list 2. Now, is it ultra vires parliament's power? And there you go into the pith and substance. What is the real nature of the matter? And if there's incidental trenching, you don't really bother, the law will be still valid. For example, I abolish or I give relief to agriculturists. What am I doing? And suppose, for example, those loans are based on promissory notes and negotiable instruments, and I waive those loans. And am I dealing with negotiable instruments or am I dealing with money lending? So the pith and substance, it's for debt relief, for agricultural indebtedness, and it falls within list 2, and therefore it is valid. Incidentally, it deals with other points it doesn't really. There are a number of cases. I want to tell the audience that aspect theory, which has been come down, I personally feel it's a completely mistaken notion which our Supreme Court has introduced into our constitution. If you read the history of the aspect theory, where it came from the Privy Council, dealing with the Canadian law, where they say that a particular law may have a provincial aspect and may have a federal aspect, a union aspect and a state aspect. Then they go on to say in the next 2-3 paragraphs, when it has different aspects, you find out what is the main feature of the act, what is the pith and substance of the act. If the predominant feature is a federal feature and not a provincial feature, then the parliamentary law prevails. Unfortunately, we have taken aspect theory to be a separate theory, separate doctrine. You must understand that it is a subset of pith and substance. A law has different aspects. Find out what is the predominant aspect and then apply pith and substance. So the judgment in the federation case, in my humble opinion, is completely wrong. Go to harmonious construction that all of us know. You have two conflicting provisions. You reconcile them. Go to the next slide, please. So the first slide deals with 3 doctrines. I go to the next slide, which deals with 6 more. One is severability, the good part from the bad part. If the good part and the bad part is so intertwined that the whole statute fails, then that's the sad fate of that law. Occupied field, which says that it applies to list 3. Recently, the Supreme Court has given a judgment on the question of, in the case of Jayant Verma versus Union, where they said that if the state governments have enacted debt relief laws, then under the Banking Regulation Act, you can't intrude upon that area. That becomes an occupied field as far as the state government is concerned. That's a completely interesting aspect which has to be studied more in detail. What about Article 246? Even if it is occupied by the state, cannot Parliament pass a law overriding that if Parliament is acting within its own competence? But occupied field, which is normally applied to list 3 subjects, has this time been applied in a conflict between list 1 and list 2. That's an interesting point, but we don't have time to discuss it further. Reading down. So idea is you save a statute, don't strike it down. Striking down should be a last resort. If possible, read down a particular section and save it by reducing the impact of a particular provision. Prospective overruling, we know that laid down in Golaknath. Unless a judgment says it's prospective, it will operate from the previous day. Now, there are 2 points here I would like to share with the audience. The Supreme Court in Golaknath says it applies only to the Supreme Court. Till today, after 50 years, I don't know why. Why can't the High Courts pass a judgment saying that we are striking down a state legislature or a union law and our judgment is prospective? What's the logic? Why can't the High Courts do so? I think they can. And other interesting case now pending before the Constitution bench in the Supreme Court is the case of the aftermath of Subramanian Swamy's case. As all of you know, in this case, the Supreme Court said that, there was under the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act, the CBI, the police could not inquire into officers above the rank of Joint Secretary without a sanction, without a permission from the central government, prior permission. So Justice Lodha has said, no, Article 14, corruption is corruption. It doesn't really matter whether you're an undersecretary or an additional secretary or a chief secretary. All are same, strike it down. No problem with that law. Now, this case was filed in 2003 or 4. It was finally decided in 2015. What happens in those 12 years? Now, with the judgment delivered in 2015, what happens to cases which have taken place in between? There has been an acquittal, there has been a conviction, there has been a prosecution without sanction. In some cases, sanction has been refused. What happens to that? So there are judgments which now say that if a law is struck down later, it should not disturb concluded positions earlier. That's going to be an interesting question which will come up. Eclipse, we know that when you strike down a law, the law doesn't, it is only eclipsed. When that limitation is removed, the law acquires force, as the Supreme Court said, proprio vigore in Bikaji Naren Daktar's case. Now, that again, for the audience, I may say that raises a huge controversy of when is a law void, when is a law voidable. If it's ultra vires the Constitution, is it a voidable enactment? Is it a void enactment? Is it void ab initio? So many controversies come within that point also. So doctrine of eclipse within itself has got several facets. Of course, the last is proportionality, which all of us are familiar. Modern dental college, you apply the law as proportionately as possible. Try to have the least possible intrusion into rights. So these are the 9 doctrines. 2 gentle points are raised, and I'll go straight away to the examples. Can I have the next slide, please? The next slide, please. One thing I want to clarify, there is an unfortunate observation in Vasant Kumar's case that ordinary rules of interpretation are not applicable to the Constitution. In my humble view, that is a wrong statement. In 1951, as early as 51, in Keshav Madhav Menon dealing with the Bombay law, the Constitution bench said established rules of interpretation apply to Article 13 as well. Then you go to Chandramohan's case, the famous judgment of Hidayatullah, where he says fundamental rules of interpretation are the same. Whether you're interpreting a constitution or interpreting a statute, fundamental rules are same. And I personally feel, going into this, rules established rules. See Article 367, that's the answer. 367 says when you interpret the Constitution, General Clause Act apply. Now you'll find in our Constitution, very interestingly, the definition clause is in 366. It's in part 19 towards the end. 367 is the interpretation article. It says General Clause Act applies. Now, if you go back to Government of India Act 1935, section 311 is the definition section. But it is not, the marginal note doesn't say definition, it says interpretation. Now, I was wondering why they don't have this provision of General Clause Act in 311. Then the answer could be, if the Government of India Act is an act of Parliament itself, then automatically the General Clause Act applies. There's no need to mention that it should be applicable. But in our Constitution, they took the trouble of saying, for the Constitution also, General Clause Act will apply to interpret. So I think that really sorts out the problem. And finally, I was just doing some research. Common example is ejusdem generis. It's applied in many taxing statutes, where general words follow special words, what will happen. And it has been applied to Article 31A. Jagir, Inam, Muafi, or other similar grant. That other similar grant was interpreted ejusdem generis, which the earlier words. So I think we can bury this controversy and say that the principles of interpretation will apply, particularly in India, where 80% of your law is nothing but the old Act of Parliament. Now the next slide, please. These are basic principles. I'll just dispose them off in a minute. Yes, all laws are constitutionally presumed to be constitutional. The burden of proof is on the petitioner to show it's unconstitutional. Generally, constitution must receive a broad and liberal construction, unlike a taxing statute which may require a strict construction, or a penal statute may require a strict construction. Here, terms must be interpreted broadly and liberally. The other important point is legislative practice is relevant, and that you can note, those who are interested in making a note. See Gannon-Dunkley, the first Gannon-Dunkley of AIR 1958 Supreme Court at page 560, where the question was, what's the meaning of the word sale? The argument was, words in the entries must be read liberally. So sale would also include works contract. But Justice Venkatramaya, in a brilliant judgment, said no. He said, when sale was introduced in the Government of India Act and then in the Constitution, it had a definite meaning. What is the legislative practice? How did the local legislations use the word sale? In that sense, he said, sale means it's nomen juris, as used in the Sale of Goods Act. There should be a transfer of goods, transferor, transferee, consideration. All these things should be there. And therefore, he said, adding works contract to sale was unconstitutional, and the Madras General Sales Tax Act was struck down. Motive is not relevant. Next point. One excellent example, and I would request readers to read this judgment, listeners to read this judgment, is the Sarbanda Sonowal case, where the migration from Bangladesh to Assam, Justice Mathur expressly says that the law was passed with a bad motive. I have not seen, to my best of my knowledge, very rare to see a Supreme Court commenting on the motive with which a law is passed, but this is one unique example. Foreign decisions where there are conflicting judgments, I think there should be no controversy at all. We have borrowed from so many constitutions. Your 31 is from Japan, your 25, 26 is from Ireland. Therefore, there should be no objection to referring to foreign decisions where you want to interpret a constitution. So these are now 8 slides, and I'll conclude the theory part, and let's now go to how these have been applied. Now, what is fascinating is these are all theories of interpretation. The Supreme Court is faced with a problem. It has to arrive at a decision. What are the tools? What is the methods by which they arrive at this conclusion? And that you can see, I have taken about 4 or 5 cases. It's not possible in the short time to deal with number of cases. I've just taken 4 or 5 cases where I found that different theories and different doctrines have been very interestingly applied. So kindly go to the next slide. Now, if you take our constitutional history, I feel that from 50 to 67, a large part of the confrontation between the legislature and the judiciary could have been avoided if the legislature had been reasonably fair in paying not the full compensation, but at least a reasonable compensation to the persons whose property was acquired. All this tussle was to take over the property and pay virtually nothing, right up to bank nationalization. This was the entire problem between the legislature and the judiciary. But for our case, let's go to the initial cases, how different theories were applied. Now, immediately after the constitution came into force in 1950, a series of high courts struck down zamindari legislation on the ground that the principles of compensation were completely contrary to Article 31, to 14, to 19(1)(f), and so on. What was the answer? Introduce 31A, make them agrarian reforms immune from. As I said, to get over the zamindari laws being struck down, they had 31B, 9 schedule. You put the law there, no challenge from Part 3. Now, how did the court uphold it? Shankari Prasad, they said, look at 368. If you take this Shankari Prasad's case, it's a classic case of textual interpretation like A.K. Gopalan. They said go by 368. It simply says you can amend the constitution. They don't say you can amend the constitution except fundamental right. There's no such provision. Anything can be amended. So why not Part 3 also? That was the logic. But I have a small caveat there. If you read that judgment carefully, I have no quarrel. You want to interpret 368, interpret it literally. But when it comes to 30, when it comes to law, then you fail that no, if law is interpreted literally, fundamental rights cannot be taken away. And then you take a different interpretation. You say law means, if it's parliamentary law, it's subject to Part 3. But if it is amendment, it's constituent power and therefore not subject. So this is a kind of a basic. Now you come to, so the first case was where there was a textual interpretation going by the original, what the parties intended. And you find in the judgment reference to the overwhelming majority of, majority which the party had got. They had the mandate of the people for agrarian reform. All those things have influenced the decision in Shankari Prasad. Now, I come to Sajjan Singh, which according to me is the most important case in this question of basic structure. This is really a turning point or a tipping point, which is coming to, which has to be considered. Now, look at the scenario by 1965. You had 17 amendments in 15 years. And for the first time, two judges, as I said, 3:2, two judges, Hidayatullah and Mudholkar, they said, please pause. Please pause. Is a little interpretation enough? Hidayatullah asked the question that take away fundamental rights. He asked it, he puts it very nicely. He said, are fundamental rights the playthings of the majority? That's the question he raised. And then he said that, look, this power to amend may not be absolute. There may be some limitations, but he leaves it at that. And he supports the conclusion. He said, yes, 17th Amendment is valid, but he flags this question on the question of the power to amend. Mudholkar is even more eloquent. He refers for the first time, and please note, this is not in Golaknath, but in Sajjan Singh for the first time, the word essential features has been used by Justice Mudholkar. And he says, can we take away everything so that what is left is not a constitution at all? And following a Pakistani Supreme Court judgment, he says essential features, maybe you cannot take it away. But then that is the view taken by Mudholkar. But for the first time, you'll find that textualism is abandoned and the other principles, as to what is the structure of the constitution, what is the intention of the makers, what are the historical background, all those things are put together in Sajjan Singh. Now, these judges don't go theory by theory. They reach a conclusion. And in that conclusion, you can analyze that this could be possible. This could possibly be the theory they applied to reach their conclusion. Now go to the next case. Next slide, please. Golaknath. Of course, I won't. Golaknath was a case where there was a 180-degree turn from a case where power was unlimited. Here it says that no part of fundamental rights can be touched. A complete 360-degree, 180-degree turn. And Subbarao judgment is interesting. Subbarao judgment says that his basis, his reasoning or the rationale for arriving at this diametrically opposite conclusion is very interesting. He says, look at 368. It says procedure for amending the constitution. So he's saying it's not the substantive source of power. This procedural article cannot take over a substantive article like 13. Very interesting way of approaching it. And he tries to trace the amending power to 248 and 97, and he says all are subject to part 13. And with this, we go to the mega case, the Mahabharata of our constitution, so to speak, which is the Kesavan Bharati case. Now, kindly see the slide carefully. I have said 7:6, or rather 6.6:6.4. As you know, Golaknath was 6:5 and this was 7:6. I say 6.6:6.4 because Justice Khanna, if you see his judgment, 60% he agrees with the majority and 40% the minority. I mean, virtually most parts he agrees with the minority, and only in the case of basic features he turns the table, and ultimately that became the decisive judgment. Now, please see the background. One way there is a very, very interesting run-up to bank nationalization, to this Kesavan Bharati case. Please look back at history. From 1967, from Golak to Kesavan Bharati, what happened? 1969, you struck down bank nationalization. 1970, pre-purses went. 1973, Bennett Coleman went. All these cases were struck down. And Justice Holmes has put it very nicely. He says that the judiciary is not immune from the hydraulic pressure of what happens around them. What is the hydraulic pressure of society? Why think of the basic structure? Till Pandit Nehru was alive, nobody thought that they will take away Article 21, they'll take away 19. Nobody thought. They said, yes, we can give them unlimited power, our fundamental rights are safe. That was the perhaps impression. Now, by the time you came to Kesavan Bharati, look at the amendments. 24, 25, 26, and 29. 24th, they they completely got over Golaknath. They said how to amend, even fundamental rights can be amended. 25th was very important, and 31C, that was the only part which was struck down, which was said that a legislature can make a law. It can just put a declaration that this is to achieve directive principles. Once that declaration is made, like virtually 9th schedule, you can't question it. It's beyond judicial review. Then 26th was abolished privy purses, and 29th was the Kerala reforms. Now, if you read Kesan Bharati in full, the government actually won. They succeeded. 24th was upheld, 26th was remanded and upheld later, 29th was upheld, 25th upheld fully except that small part of 31C. So it was almost like an 85% victory for the government. But the basic structure tilted everything. And why the basic structure? Now look at how the Supreme Court, now if you take the minority, all have gone by textual orientation, historical orientation. But look at Khanna. Khanna goes into structuralism, and see the next slide. Please see the next slide. Yes. The majority said the power to amend is not the power to destroy. You can amend it, but you can destroy it. And if you read some of the passages of Khanna, he says, look at 368 carefully. Read this section, article. It says the Constitution. It says this Constitution. I can amend the Constitution. I can amend this Constitution. So he says pre-amendment and post-amendment, the Constitution will continue. There will be a Constitution before the amendment. There will be a Constitution after the amendment. You must ask yourself the question. Post-amendment, what will remain? Will it be a constitution at all? In other words, suppose hypothetically we accepted the minority view. You go back to the Shankari Prasad case that everything can be amended. Suppose the government tomorrow simply removes entire part 3, removes 25 and 26. It's the same constitution. Are we a same democracy? Are we a republic? Answer is no. And that's why Khanna then evolved the basic feature theory. So basic feature theory was basically came across a multiple theories being put together, the structure of the constitution, how the amendment power is circulated, what is the interplay of fundamental rights, directive principles, limitations on power, separation of power. All those things had a beautiful interplay, and you had. Now go to the minority view. They're equally well reasoned. Take Justice Palekar's judgment, which I have cited. He makes a very interesting argument. He says that 368, read the text. There is no such limitation. Why are you reading into it? And he refers to Article 5. It should be Roman 5. Article 5 of the US Constitution. That has got similarity with 368. There also you can amend the Constitution by 2/3 majority in Congress. In Article 5 of the US Constitution, there is a limitation. You can't amend certain portions. So Palekar asked the question, Justice Palekar asked the question, if our makers, they obviously had the US Constitution before them, why didn't they add that in our Constitution? So that shows that they wanted to keep an unlimited power of amendment. Now, this is how the Kesan Bharati case took place. Now, please come to the next case, which I've just taken 3 or 4 cases in a shortage of time. Now, I come to the ADM Jabalpur case, and I would request all of you to read the minority judgment of Khanna. It contains the entire essence of interpretation of the Constitution. I think perhaps no other judgment in one single judgment contains so many multiple principles of interpretation as Justice Khanna had. Now, I would like you to visualize the emergency. My young friends may not have been born at that time, but I've lived through it. I was in college in Bombay, and we had complete emergency, no freedom of press, nothing. Now, please see the first point, Article 21 and 22, right to liberty, preventive detention, 22, plus presidential proclamation under 395. Effectively, what they said was, your right to approach the courts for violation of 21 and 22 is completely gone. So, textual interpretation on 21 and 22, read the articles and read the presidential proclamation, strict construction. So the majority said that putting these together, nobody can approach the court. Now, it is interesting to read the High Court judgments. John Street, ADM Jabalpur, Read some of the High Court judgments from Bombay, Nagpur, and so on. What the High Court said was 21 is suspended, no problem. 22 is gone, no problem. But if the person has been detained under MISA, that is Maintenance of Internal Security Act, the dreaded MISA as it was called, but the provisions of MISA are not satisfied or have been violated, then we can set aside the detention and grant relief on the ground of violation of MISA and not because 21 is affected. 21 is still there, but if the statutory provisions are invalid, have not been complied with, he has to be set free. And they said 226, there is no limitation. We have got powers to do it. The word is other purposes. But sadly, High Courts are overruled. And the Supreme Court said, even if the detention was contrary to any law, any regulation, still High Courts had no power under 226 to set at right a person, even if the detention is invalid. And they said that even if your fundamental rights are not violated, no relief. They simply said, yes, your detention is invalid. You must read the majority judgment. They say, yes, the detention was invalid, but your right to approach the court is gone. In other words, there is a right, but there is no remedy during the remedy. Now, please come to Khanna's judgment. Now, in this historical background, where there is sort of darkness as far as all human rights are concerned, everything is suspended, courts have gone complete into the limbo, you had then the 42nd Amendment followed. But you must see Khanna's judgments, the way he applies multiple theories and says that, look, notwithstanding the emergency, notwithstanding suspension of all rights, the right to life still remains, the powers of the High Court and the Supreme Court still remain. Now look at what he does. First, it's not a very big judgment, it's about 100 paragraphs, and I would recommend everybody read it. He first starts off with Plato, goes to the Magna Carta, goes to the US Supreme Court. He then goes to the judgments of Lord Atkin and so on in the Second World War, where despite the emergency powers, the courts interfered in certain cases. So he goes into all that. Then, second part. So the first part is like a historical part of the interpretation, theory of interpretation. Then 21. Khanna makes a very important point. He says that 21 is not the source of right to life. He says, go to pre-1950. Go to section 491 of the CRPC. Even before independence, in colonial Britain, in England, colonial India, you had the right of habeas corpus. A magistrate could, powers of the habeas corpus were there with the criminal courts. So he says the right to life is not granted by 21. Right to life exists. Then the next point, which I think is absolutely magnificent, is the rule of law. In about 18 or 19 paragraphs, Justice Khanna discusses rule of law and says that in a country of rule of law, notwithstanding suspension of right, rule of law still prevails, that can never be taken away. Please go to the next slide. After analyzing, he makes a very passionate plea. You can see always the man grappling, struggling to give relief. He says, if you accept that 21 is gone, 22 is gone, and you have no remedy before any court, what are you saying? What is the consequence of what you're saying? You are saying that the executive is not governed by any law. The executive is not answerable to any court. And that, he says, is not permissible under our constitution, notwithstanding suspension of these rights. He then goes on to UN Declaration of Human Rights, that we have signed the charter. Then he again goes to historical method of interpretation. He says, look at the US Constitution. Now the argument was under Article 226, you can issue writ of mandamus, certiorari, quo warranto, and habeas corpus. The presidential proclamation does not suspend Article 226. And Justice Khanna says, look at Article 1, Section 9 of the US Constitution. There, habeas corpus can be suspended in terms of armed rebellion and certain other cases. He says, we have got Article 226, we have got the habeas corpus, but we never included that provision. So if you go by textualism also, go by historical provisions also, Khanna says, there is no way you can take away right and liberty. And finally, he makes a conclusion and 12 reasons. And to my audience, I would suggest, I would strongly recommend you please read this minority judgment. And to make it easier and more enjoyable, I may use the word, go to his conclusion in para 220 of the AR reports. 12 reasons are given for his conclusion. Read the conclusions first, and then you please come back to the reasoning which he gives. That will make it more interesting. Let's go to the next. I'll now shortly wind up. Next slide, please. Yeah. What are other examples? Like, I have not included many, like Indira Gandhi's case, I didn't mention because of shortage of time. But you take, for example, Minerva Mills. What did Minerva Mills do? The 42nd Amendment tried to set at naught Kesan Bharati. They didn't succeed in this review case. Then they had this 42nd Amendment where they simply said any amendment of the Constitution from 1950 onwards shall not be questioned on any ground whatsoever. So every amendment became judicial review proof. Nobody could question any amendment. Supreme Court very interestingly said amending power itself is subject to judicial basic structure, and they struck down those provisions 4, 5 and 52 of the 42nd Amendment Act. The amendment to 368 was struck down. Then SP Gupta's case, very interesting. This again shows the importance of interpretation. The word used in Article 124 is consultation. In 1982, consultation doesn't mean concurrence. Now take SP Gupta's case. It's very fascinating how consultation in 1982 meaning it means only consultation, that you have to only, the judiciary didn't have the last say, the executive has the last say. How does it become concurrence? How and why? There again, the hydraulic pressure theory, what happened in society, why was this necessary? Why had to give a purposive interpretation to 124? Of course, it has got a lot of critics. People say there is no basis for completely changing this. But again, they've used different methods of interpretation. A lengthy judgments have been given by people and said why ultimately judiciary must have the last say in judicial appointments. So consultation becomes concurrence. Take Madras Bar Association, where the National Tax Tribunal Act was struck down. What did the Supreme Court say? In our constitution, take the structure of the constitution. This is a classic structural case. Core judicial functions. What are questions of law? Decisions on questions of law. They said this can never be given to a tribunal, and they struck it down. And finally, I'll go to Puttaswamy's case, the privacy case. Where is privacy mentioned in part 3? Nowhere. Where is it mentioned in the American Constitution? Nowhere. Yet, take Puttaswamy, privacy. Take Justice Nariman's judgment. He traces it to liberty, fraternity, 19.1a, 19.1d, 21. It's called. He says privacy permeates throughout part 3. Now you have a case where privacy has become a fundamental right, although it's not mentioned anywhere. This is the beauty of constitutional interpretation. As times have gone by, as we have crossed almost 70 years of our independence, what fundamental rights were actually given, we have now introduced a new right, which is privacy. And this judgment is an excellent example of judicial creativity and judicial interpretation, and introducing privacy as part of fundamental rights. Last point. I'll just come to the last slide. Next slide, please. Now, the Sabrimala review is pending. The bench has prepared 7 questions to be referred to as a 9-judge bench. Now, again, all lawyers have to apply these theories of interpretation, doctrines of interpretation, and try to get a solution. I ask myself the question, what theory are we going to apply? Are we going to go by the textual interpretation? Can we say that, look at 25 and 26, it talks of public morality. Don't go into history, don't go into debates. Public morality means public morality. Where's the question of reading it as constitutional morality? Where is the place for constitutional morality? Then is 14 and 25, 26 interdependent? Are you going to harmoniously interpret 14 with 25 and 26 and say that yes, the right to equality is there, but in rare cases, like if it's a tradition of 700 years and it's not prejudicial to public interest, you can have it. So it's really interesting. So this is where different doctrines and different cases can be applied. So friends, I have tried to give you the theories, doctrines, and discussed a few cases. In the short time I've got, it's already 4 o'clock. In the short time I've got, I could not deal with more cases. But I would tell you that when you are doing a constitutional case, please bear in mind these theories, please bear in mind these doctrines. And I thought of the analogy of Edward de Bono's 6 thinking hats. You got the yellow hat, you got the red hat, you got the green hat, etc. And you apply different hats to a problem. So these are the different hats of interpretation, if I may say so. Depending on the question, depending on the problem, see how you can apply it and try to arrive at the solution. And with that, I will conclude by just paying a humble tribute to Justice Khanna by quoting the last part of his dissenting judgment. And I would like all of you to read it carefully with me. A dissent in a court of last resort, to use his words. His words are the words of Chief Justice Hughes, is an appeal to the brooding spirit of the law, to the intelligence of a future day, when a later decision may possibly correct the error into which the dissenting judge believes the court to have been betrayed. Nothing could be better put. I thank you all for a patient audience for patiently hearing me. Now I'll answer any questions. You can ask the host to put up the questions to me and I'll answer them.
First question that we have is from Ami Parekh, and she's asked, how does one decide which theory of interpretation to apply, and are there any parameters?
Yes, that's an interesting question. See, now there is no litmus test that if this problem comes, you can apply this theory. Suppose, for example, you're challenging, let's say, like a Sabrimala issue, you're challenging the provisions of validity of 14, 25, and 26. I would say that you take the textual thing, read the text. Now, you want an answer. You want to say that, let's say, you want to argue for the proposition that the banning of women into the Sabrimala temple is not invalid. It should be what the old tradition should continue. Then you see what is the history, what is the textual provision, what's the structure of the constitution. So, as Akhil Amar, these are all strands of different rope. You weave them to give a medical analogy. It's not just one drug for one thing. Maybe a mixture of drugs has to be given to solve a particular problem. And I would recommend that you take theory by theory in a particular problem, see whether X theory applies, then the next, then the next. Similarly, go to the doctrines wherever applicable, see what best applies to your case, and then weave out your answer to your, that will enable you to prepare your brief for argument before court. Yeah. Next question.
Yes, sir. So the next question that we have is from Rugved Upadhyay. His question is, how do the Constituent Assembly debates hold relevance today, especially related to those proposed amendments which were rejected?
Those proposed amendments?
Which were rejected.
No, I think the CAD debates, in fact, that's important because right up till Sajjan Singh and so on, they refer to debates. Wherever you go by textual interpretation, the judges were reluctant to go to the debate. They said, let us see the article as it is. There's no need to go to what the assembly said. But now, virtually every important constitutional case, we go into constitutional assembly debates. Now, suppose a particular provision was deleted. Why was it deleted? What was the reason? Now, for example, take the 42nd Amendment, 323 and 323B. They are now Constitution. They were part of the 42nd Amendment. Now, in the 44th Amendment, when the bill came to the Parliament, when it went to Rajya Sabha, the Janata government did not have a majority. Therefore, they refused to allow this amendment. They allowed the other amendment. They didn't allow it. So this is a case where they rejected the proposal. And that's the reason. Now, suppose, for example, a particular word was by the amendment. Then you can use it to say that, look, the interpretation put by the other side is not correct. One reason could be that though this was proposed in the amendment in the Constituent Assembly, they thought that it is at best, it should not be included. If they thought so, then why interpret it in that particular manner? Next, please.
Thank you, sir. The next question that we have is from Maulik. The question is, in the case Animal Welfare Board versus Union of India 2014, the Honorable SC held that fundamental rights are available to animals as well. According to you, is that the correct interpretation?
Fundamental rights are available to?
Are available to animals as well. Fundamental rights are available to animals as well.
I don't think it's the correct way because fundamental rights are given to persons. Only one thing, you can have prevention of cruelty to animals. That could be part of the that may be what's called an ethical interpretation. The ethos of a civilized society doesn't permit cruelty to animals. But it's a far different thing from saying that they have fundamental rights. Then where do you stop? Do they have 14? Do they have 19? Where do you stop? So I don't think that's a correct proposition. But I have to see actually in what context the Supreme Court said so. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Dr. Sanjay Jain. His question is, should unicameral parliament have been conceived as an amending body to add the 9th schedule in the constitution? His question is, should a unicameral parliament have been conceived as the amending body to add the 9th schedule in the constitution?
Well, I personally feel 9th schedule should not have a place at all. But having said that, maybe yes, it should. That could have been a better safeguard before you put a case into the 9th schedule. You have a decision of both. Yes.
The next question is from Ganesh Rajgopalan. His question is, when do international treaties need to be implemented into municipal law? Can such implementation be partial? Can international treaty be frustrated by future legislation?
Yes, of course, yes. For international Article 253 and our Constitution very clearly says the international treaty will not become municipal law unless we make a consequential parliamentary legislation. And if it's an international treaty, like for example, Vienna Convention, we are not signed it. There's so many treaties we are not signatory to. So Parliament is always supreme. An international treaty by itself will not have application. But there are a number of judgments which say that if two interpretations are possible, that which supports the international treaty should be adopted. In fact, that's also what Khanna says in this ADM Jabalpur case. Yes. Next.
Right. The next question is, sir, what is your view on interpretation given by the Supreme Court in case related to granting the status of legal person to a river, for example, the Ganga and Yamuna? The apex court overruled the judgment of the Uttarakhand High Court in this case.
Well, I really can't comment because I've not seen the judgment in detail. Now, you just now said, can animals have fundamental rights? Now you're saying river is a person. I can't comment until I read that judgment because we have to see in what context they said so. Was there a rigorous reasoning to arrive at a conclusion that a river is a person? Then if river is a person, then is it subject to Article 14? The river can't argue its own case. So like an idol, will it be a representative? So many interesting questions come up, but I don't think river is a person. That is not what is intended. Then why not forest is a person? Why not mines and minerals persons? Where do you draw it? I don't think that's correct.
Right, sir. The next question is, sir, would the debate around the words Constituent Assembly in Article 370 also form part of the basic structure of the Constitution?
No, it will not.
Okay. The next question is whether state in Article 19(2) includes all local and other authorities by virtue of Article 12. If yes, would it mean that other authorities have constitutional sanction to make any restriction on fundamental rights?
Well, if you got, for example, it does happen. You got the right to move. The local municipality may have some zoning regulations that restricts your movement. That again has to satisfy the test of 19(2) to 19(6). Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is, are there any overlapping features in the doctrine of pith and substance and the doctrine of culpable legislation? If so, what is the fine line distinguishing the difference between the two?
Well, as far as culpable legislation is concerned, overlapping doesn't really arise. It arises very often in pith and substance. Because and has happened most often in taxing statutes, where, for example, let's say software, is it a service or are they goods? Or you take, for example, a common example is leasing transactions. Now, under the 46th Amendment, lease is deemed to be a sale. Transfer of right to use is deemed to be a sale. Now, so if it's transfer of right to sale, you can levy sales tax. But leasing is also a service. So you can levy service tax, which is in list 1 under 1997. Now, in this case, overlapping, it can be sorted out by pith and substance. So if you ask me a question, if you're levying a tax on leasing and it has been taken under Article 366(29)(a) as a sale, then there should be no power to levy a service tax on that leasing again. So there, pith and substance will apply. And I think Supreme Court has wrongly applied this question of service tax. Take professions. Tax on professions is entry 60. You now say entry should be given a liberal interpretation. So profession will include a tax on profession, can also include a service tax on profession. But again, Supreme Court has gone into aspect theory and said service aspect is different, this aspect is different. Completely mixed up the whole thing. Go by simple pith and substance, find out the predominant nature, sort out the problem.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
The next question that we have is from Amol Kale. He says, Dr. Ambedkar gave us 3 warnings. The second of it was not to lay liberties at the feet of even a great man or to trust him with power which enables him to subvert the institution. Can you explain the relevance of this warning for today's constitutionals?
Why today's constitution? Giving too much power to any one particular person is always important. Again, you go back to Madison. We don't have a government of angels. We require checks and balances. And as it has often been quoted, the person, the powerful leader who it may be over the history, he's doing something from what he believes to be right for the people. But yet, even if, more rights have been violated by overzealous people, believing what they're doing right, and that's how you require checks and balances. So whatever good you want to do must be within the parameters of the Constitution. And apart, as he mentioned, Dr. Ambedkar, so many things he mentioned have not been followed. For example, he said, don't have reservation more than 50%. Are you following that? He said, you have only up to a certain period. So there's so many things Ambedkar which are not followed. It's very easy to quote him when it suits you, but you are not followed many things of what he has said.
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Hiten Chande. His question is, whether the restriction imposed on the tribunal under Section 254 of the Income Tax Act to grant a stay subject only to a payment of 20% of the outstanding demand encroaches upon the judicial function of the tribunal and impinges the doctrine of separation of powers, and to that extent unconstitutional.
According to me, yes. But there are, unfortunately, our Supreme Court has said that the right of appeal is a creature of a statute. It can be subject to certain restrictions. In the case of municipal laws, they have said even 100% pre-deposit is valid. Fortunately, in that Maldia Chemicals, they said that more than 75% makes the appeal illusionary and therefore it is arbitrary. But according to me, this 20% mandate is extremely incorrect. It is a serious encroachment on judicial power. And now that you ask a question, I would request the audience to see a fantastic judgment of the Privy Council from Mauritius. It's called Khairati's case. Article 1 of the Mauritius Constitution simply says Mauritius is a country governed by rule of law. That's all. There was a law which said that the judiciary could not grant bail in certain drug offences. That the Privy Council struck down, saying that if a country is ruled by law, rule of law, to grant or not to grant bail is a judicial function. And therefore, that was struck down. Unfortunately, we have said, no, we need not have granted bail. Like in Tada cases or Pota cases, bail need not be granted. And even today, I'm sorry to say that you keep on reducing the judicial discretion. This gentleman's question is absolutely correct. It is completely unconstitutional. And it's time we relook at this entire thing of taking away powers of stay and taking away discretion. Apart from the stay, they say beyond 365 days or beyond 180 days, the stay will not continue. I mean, this is completely violating our basic principles of rule of law.
Thank you, sir. The next question that we have is from Priyanka Kapadia. She says, one argument advanced in support of the CAA is that it has nothing to do with NRC and NPR, and that they are mutually distinct. Can speeches made by cabinet ministers in parliament linking them to take cognizance of in testing the virus of the legislation?
I lost this question. CA question was not heard by me fully. Hello?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Yes. So the question was, one argument advanced in support of the CAA is that it has nothing to do with the NRC, NPR, and that they are mutually distinct. The question is, can speeches made by cabinet ministers in parliament linking them be taken into cognizance in testing the virus of the legislation?
Well, the speech of parliament can definitely be referred to. That won't be a clinching factor. But in the course of your argument, there will be one further additional argument in your favor to say that, look, this was what was discussed in parliament. This was what the minister said. But that will not be conclusive. There are judgments which say that nobody speaks for Parliament. Parliament passes the law and that's it. So you can't say because the minister said something, they are bound by it. That cannot be correct. But definitely in the course of interpreting, when two views are possible, what the minister said would be definitely a relevant factor. In fact, in the Aadhaar case, we did refer to statements made in Parliament as well.
All right. The next question that we have is from Mr. Viraj Yargol. Someone is not on mute. Can you please put yourself on mute? The question that we have from Mr. Viraj Yargol is, what is the importance of extraneous evidence in interpreting fundamental rights?
So what does he mean by extraneous evidence? If he means, for example, now to interpret fundamental rights, we have got Constituent Assembly debates, we have got questions and answers in Parliament, they can be referred to, then you can refer to foreign decisions. So all these things are extraneous. That is what is meant by extraneous evidence. These are all what you call aids to interpretation, which can be referred to.
Thank you, sir. The next question that we have is from Ranveer. He asks, how do we place secularism in the basic structure of the Constitution by applying the doctrines, given that it was inserted after the 42nd Amendment?
Well, secularism, no, they have now taken secularism as part of the basic structure. It was introduced, as you know, in the 42nd Amendment. And interestingly, for this person who asked this question, if you see the 45th Amendment Bill, which then became the 44th Amendment Act, there was a proposal to define what is secularism. Secularism is a country which respects all religions. That was the meaning sought to be given. And the state has no religion at all. For some inexplicable reason, the Congress party, which had majority in the Rajya Sabha, defeated this particular provision. They did not allow the definition of secularism to continue. That is the part. So I would definitely say, yes, it is part of basic structure, because if you're decided to be a country where it's not a theocratic country where we got a Hindu religion is a national religion or Islam is a national religion like in our neighboring Pakistan. Once it's secularism, then it's part of our basic feature. The fundamental feature of our constitution is all religions are equal. The state respects no religion. In fact, Mr. Palkhiwala first said secular is a wrong word. He had a view which he gave a lecture in Madras. He said, we are not a secular state, we are a non-denominational state. That is the real thing according to him. Anyway.
The next question that... Yes, Tatira.
How many more questions are there?
There's one specific question, and the other questions are a little bit more generic in nature. So should I ask the one specific question first?
Okay.
So the question, Mr. Tatar, is removal of holding a property from being a fundamental right to insertion in Article 300A during emergency open for challenge?
No, because now they've held that property is not a fundamental right. It's also not part of basic structure. That chapter is over now.
Okay. There are a couple of fairly generic questions, Mr. Tatar. Do we have time for those?
Yeah, we can go on till 4:30. I mean, if the audience is willing to, we can go on from the 10 minutes.
Okay, sure. So one question, so Farin Khan has two questions. The first is, are good intentions more important than written laws? And the second is, why do we talk about human rights and not human responsibilities?
Yes, good intentions. As I said, men are not, we don't have a government of angels. And I think all law must start with a good intention. If the intention is bad, then again that augurs ill for the citizen. Of course, motive is not a relevant factor. But to answer his questions, good intentions, not a question of more important, good intentions are as important as reasonable laws. In fact, good intention is the starting point, or the, what you call, is the acorn which leads to a oak tree of good laws. And the second question I didn't follow. What was it? Second one? What was the second question?
Yes, sir. The second question was, why do we talk about human rights and not human responsibilities?
We have got, they are human rights, and they, of course, there are corresponding limitations also. They put a duty there, but our constitution has not imposed an obligation that there is a duty, but there is no corresponding obligation. In fact, to tell him, John F. Kennedy had a very good quote. He said that all of us have the fundamental right of speech, but we don't have the obligation to think before we speak. That's a problem in all constitutions, yes.
उस किताब को पढ़ना पड़ेगा, समझे? हिंदुस्तान से ज्यादा इशारा सपोर्ट करता है.
Hello, yes.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Kavita Jha, please put yourself on mute. We now have a question from Mr. Sirvai, who has asked, does the Supreme Court pay heed to well-settled principles of interpretation? Reading several judgments, one gets the feeling that each judge is a law to himself when it comes to interpretation.
Navroz, thanks for that question, and I can't agree with you more. I think the increasing trend is you first decide on a conclusion, and then you decide a conclusion irrespective of whether it can be supported by rigorous reasoning or not. That is increasingly happening, and it's not a very good thing. Of course, we have good judgments like the privacy judgment, or we have got the whatever it is, well-reasoned judgments. You may or may not agree with the conclusion, but good reasons are there. But increasingly, I have a feeling as a student of law that there is no rigorous application of a particular theory to arrive at an answer. If a question is put and you want to answer, you must rigorously test it. Does it satisfy this theory? Does it satisfy this doctrine? Is it what the framers intended? And then come. Just because a conclusion is to your predilection, you should not simply go by it. I fully agree with Navroz. There's an increase. I think there is a need to have more rigorous reasoning in many of our judgments. The other point is that, unfortunately, we have abandoned this question of constitution cases being decided only by 5 judges. Now you have 2 judges benches deciding far-reaching cases on legislative competence, overlapping, and so on and so forth. But then we don't have one Supreme Court, but we have multiple Supreme Court. And with 34 judges and almost 14, 15 benches, theoretically you can have quite inconsistent, incoherent views, unintentionally, but that's what happens. And there is also an increasing tendency of, like, for example, suddenly you say that all deemed universities are also public servants and therefore the subject. And the answer is the preamble is important, corruption is not there, and so on. But this is not a rigorous reasoning at all.
Mr. Sirvai, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Thank you.
Okay, we can move on then to the next question. There's a question from Shrutanjaya Bhardwaj, who has asked, should original provisions of the Constitution be challengeable against the basic structure?
What do you mean original provisions? No, not at all. Not at all.
The next question is from Mudit. Sorry, sir.
COILO, they say that the basic structure will apply to all amendments post 24th April 1973. So you can't now challenge the 4th Amendment, Bela Banerjee's case, as violating basic structure. You can't do that.
Thank you, sir. I think the next question that we have is constitutional morality and overreaching interpretation. What is the limitation of such a principle?
In my personal first of all, it's a highly nebulous term. What do you mean by constitutional morality? Do you mean in terms of the ethos of the Constitution? Do you mean in terms of the values of the Constitution? Yes. It is, for example, taking away the right to life and liberty is an act of constitutional immorality. To that extent, even abolishing privy purses is an act of immorality. If you ask me, it's constitutionally immoral to take away a solemn promise made by Sardar Patel. So the whole issue of morality will now, constitutional morality will now be tested before the Sabrimala bench as and when it sits. Recent past, in the case of the National Capital Territory of Delhi, Justice Deepak Mishra has gone into detail on constitutional morality and then said that it's a ground even to strike down on legislation, which I have my serious doubts it has to be tested more carefully. Because what happens is there are 800 High Court judges and each one have a different perception of what is moral. Can you start striking down legislation? Even in Sabrimala case, I don't think you can take public morality as constitutional morality, but now the whole thing will be revisited. But I think this constitutional morality should It's become a flavor of the season. Everybody keeps talking about it, but it has got a very, very, very limited scope in the way Ambedkar used it and the way it is there. It is basically means reverence for the constitution or respect for conventions, but it is not a tool to strike down a legislation.
Thank you, sir. I think the next question that we have is from Mr. Hitesh Vachani, who says, Sir, can state government challenge the constitutional validity of the central law in the High Court under Article 226 if it violates the fundamental rights of the citizens? And what are its implementation? How do we interpret Article 226 in that context?
Basically, that's an interesting question, whether they go under Article 131 or they challenge it. I have a feeling they should go under Article 131 and not challenge it under 226 on violation of fundamental rights. Because I don't think you can have a case of State of Tamil Nadu versus Union of India in the High Court deciding the issue. Then can the Tamil Nadu judges decide that? What about the question of bias? Can this court decide the same question? So that's a very larger question, but I think they should preferably go under Article 131.
Thank you, sir. And the last question that we have is from Mr. Ali Fazal Bhai. He asks...
And the other thing in the question is, the rights are given to a person. Now, whether the state itself is a person, again, becomes a big question now.
So Alif asks, should we not educate citizens about fundamental duties as much as we do on fundamental rights?
Yes, I think we should. We should. Fundamental duties on Article 51A. We should educate citizens. Not only citizens, we should also educate our parliamentarians, members of the assemblies, also about the fundamental duties.
Thank you very much, sir. Statira, we do have some more questions, but I think we're now running out of time.
How many are there?
Yes,
How many are there? Because I don't want to disappoint anybody. There are 2-3 more.
There are quite a few, unfortunately, sir.
Okay. If there are 1 or 2 of them, I can take them, because what's the time now? Because I've got another conference at 4:45.
It's nearly 4:30, sir. It's 4:28.
Another 5 minutes, let's go on.
Okay, sure. The person here has not given their name, but they've said Keshav Nanda is a prime example of constitutional interpretation, much beyond textual interpretation with an end goal in mind. Do you think the liberty taken in interpreting the Constitution in this fashion proved to have more downsides than upsides several decades later? For example, the collegium system.
I think we should not link up the basic structure of Kesan Bharati with the collegium system. They are two completely different compartments. And I personally feel basic structure was an absolute necessity. And one can imagine, it's difficult to imagine what would be the consequence. In fact, we may not be having this webinar if we didn't have the basic structure. We would have lost our independence long ago, or when liberties long ago. So the basic structure was a right step. It was not taking a liberty. It became necessity to preserve and protect the Constitution. And I would fully support the theory of basic structure. It was necessary. I don't agree with the textualists and the original intention that it has no place. We required the basic structure because, you see, beyond a particular point of time, we are not a government of angels. But if then we have a government where you have dynastic politics, you have cases where they are 1/3 the legislatures are accused of serious crimes. If that is the structure of your legislative assembly, you require some serious check, and one of them is basic structure.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
There is a person who has asked for your opinion on the Sabrimala case.
Well, I'm appearing in the Sabrimala, so I won't answer. But it raises very, very interesting cases of constitutional interpretation. It may not be proper for me to comment on them, but it's an interesting case balanced on both sides, interplay of equality, religious rights, and so on. Let us see. And it's not just Sabrimala, there are also the Parsi cases there, the Muslim cases there. They are all religions are involved in this particular case. You see the 7 questions.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, what is the extent of restraints offered by Part 13 of the Constitution on states' power of taxation? Is the Jindal Steel the latest position on the issue, which is the entry tax judgment?
No, see, Part 3 is different and Part 13 is different. In my personal view, the Jindal judgment is incorrect. Part 13 talks of in between interstate trade and commerce, no state can make a law which will create imbalance between interstate and commerce. I don't see why tax is excluded. And my personal view is the view that tax laws have no place in Part 13 is incorrect in my view.
Okay. Thank you, sir. The next question is from Deepa Paturkar. She asks, how do we interpret the article which empowers the governor to nominate persons from various fields to Legislative Council of State with special reference to Maharashtra?
Well, that's a very, very controversial and burning topic on nomination of members, Article 171. Actually, if you see, you can nominate people only for science, literature, arts, and so on. Now, this is also again going to raise very interesting questions of interpretation. That where a person is not being elected, can he continue as a minister through the nominated route? And that requires a whole lot of study into what is the concept of nominated members. For example, they don't have the right to vote. They don't get MP-led funds. So it's the same kind of member. Can he be a minister? Can he be a chief minister? It's a very, very interesting question. Yeah, that's a nice point he has raised. But it requires more study, which frankly I have still to do.
Thank you, sir. So there are still more questions coming in. So I think this will go well over the time that you have allocated for us.
Yeah, just on a few minutes here.
Session?
Yeah, another 3-4 questions on this topic. I don't know. People, let's go for another 3-4 questions because people have asked them with so much enthusiasm. I don't want to disappoint them.
Sure. So the next question is from Shiva K, who has asked whether the medium to access the basic necessary fundamental rights form part of basic structure. For instance, in Anuradha Basheen, it was held that internet is necessary to carry on trade, which is a fundamental right. Now, when the government amends the laws relating to the medium to access the basic fundamental rights, the fundamental right itself will get compromised and may affect the basic structure. What is your view?
I feel that Anuradha Basheen's case, I feel the Supreme Court should have gone one step further. There's no point saying that right to internet is part of freedom of speech and expression and yet not making it mandatory. In my personal opinion, if Jammu and Kashmir is part of India, you remove 370, they've got the same rights as us. I don't see why they should not have the right to internet. No point simply saying that yes, 19 is there, give a very nice picture of what is 19(1)A, but then don't bite the bullet and say that, look, you have to give internet. Depriving a person of internet today is absolutely life and liberty, and there's no point saying I'll give them 2G, I'll give them 3G. They're entitled to, every part of India is entitled to the internet subject to various safeguards. If they can be internet in Assam and other parts, why not in Jammu and Kashmir?
Thank you, sir. The next question is from Ayush Baheti. He asks, would application of different theories not lead to uncertainty? Uncertainty because of the subjects are not sure as to what would be the position of law.
No, I don't agree at all. The point is, these are different theories available. Now, these have been categorized by various legal scholars as textual, prudential, etc., etc. So, depending on the nature of the challenge of a constitutional provision, you can use a particular theory. So, it's not that you can use a theory to come to different views. Of course, to answer him, yes, we must. It is possible you can have different views. Kesan Bharati was 7:6, applying the same theories. But that is part of the democracy, that's part of the beauty of our constitutional system. And very often the minority view, take for example Anwar Ali Sarkar, take the earlier judgments, take your ADM Jabalpur. Minority view, dissenting view was later upheld in the privacy case. So great dissents are actually, and very often you find that great dissenting judgments have become the law after 10-15 years. So I would say that different theories, if they give rise to different views, we should not be worried about it. We should welcome it. You have a better legal, you got different viewpoints and you see which is the best.
Thank you, sir. The next question that we have is from Mr. Amarnath BM. He asks, the basic structure doctrine developed in the Keshananda Bharati case is applicable for the amendments to the Constitution. Can this doctrine be used for challenging constitutional validity of a legislation? Like X legislation is unconstitutional because it is violative of basic structure.
Yes, you can. Now it's been settled. It had been my view from the beginning that if a law can be violative of basic structure, let's say, for example, secularism. Secularism is not mentioned anywhere in any statute. But suppose you make a law which is anti-secular, why can't it be struck down as part of basic structure? Separation of powers. Separation of powers is in Article 50, which is a directive principle. Why can't you have a system where you can strike it down on basic power? But that issue is now settled by the Madras Bar Association case in the National Taxation Tribunal case, where they said it can be invoked to ordinary statutes also.
Thank you, sir. The next question that we have is the GARR under Income Tax Act beyond the scope of Entry 82?
No, it is not. It's an anti-avoidance measure. It's not beyond Entry 82, not at all.
Thank you, sir.
I think we'll have 2-3 questions more and we'll stop because I've got the next conference at 4:45.
Sure. The next question is, in the last 2 decades, which are the court judgments you think stand out as the best examples of upholding constitutional values?
Best easily the right to privilege. Then you have the article in section 377 judgment. Then these are 2 immediately which come to mind. Then there, for example, you take Rumapal's judgment on Godfrey Phillips. That's a very, very important judgment. Then Sri Krishna judgment on Azadi Bachao, that's important. On constitution, that's not a constitution bench, but these 2 things immediately, privacy immediately comes to mind, and the 377 judgment comes to mind. Yes.
Thank you, sir. I'll just read out 2 more questions now. Under Article 226, can we file a writ petition in High Court during emergency?
Of course you can. It depends on what rights are suspended by the presidential proclamation under Article 359.
Thank you.
Yeah,
and the next,
because the presidential, suppose the presidential proclamation suspends 226, but now you can't do that because now after Chandrakumar 226, 136 are basic structure. There is no question of it being suspended at all anymore. In fact, for your information, the 44th Amendment has said that even now under the presidential proclamation, Article 21 can never be suspended. 359 has been amended. Whatever may be the emergency, you can't suspend 21. If you can't suspend 21, you can't suspend 26 either. 226 either.
Sure, sir. And I think there's just one last question that we'll get to, and then we can wrap up, which is whether the coronavirus COVID pandemic situation can be considered as an emergency situation and the fundamental right of the individual to file a case against the government can be entity.
It is not. See, first of all, they're not declared emergency, but I don't think a pandemic is a ground to suspend fundamental rights. You have a number of fundamental rights. Are you going to suspend reservation? Are you going to suspend equality? I don't think a pandemic has got anything to do with fundamental rights.
Okay.
Only one question arises is that public health comes under the state list. The central government can take positions as far as public health is concerned. Will a pandemic, something affecting all India, can the state center do that? That's again an interesting question.
Okay. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
I think
and I must thank the entire audience
most of the
for
questions.
I must thank the audience for listening to me patiently. All of you wish you all the best. Take care. All the best.
Mr. Datar, to say thank you for this excellent presentation and for all your efforts. I know you've taken substantial time in preparing the slides. It was really enjoyable. As an American author, Jacob Roker once said that the greatest threat to our Constitution is our ignorance of it. And I think everyone on this call would agree that this threat is now tempered after your insightful presentation, sir. Thank you so much,
Thank
sir.
you. No, and I will just, I'll just conclude. Mr. Palkiola gave a speech in Madras in December 1971. And he mentioned that all members of the legislature take an oath that they will protect, preserve the Constitution, but there is no obligation that they will ever read the Constitution. So I think all of us must at least read the Rajagopalachari in that same speech said that don't read the whole Constitution, at least read the preamble. That's the sense of our democracy, the preamble. Liberty, equality, fraternity, justice for all and so on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thanks to your entire team for organizing it.
Not at all. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.